This is Rocky Snyder. At the tone, leave your name and message and I'll get back to you.
Your spine is more twisted than Sinbad's take on marriage.
So, just give me some drugs and surgery.
Oh, I'd love to, but to be honest, modern medicine has a lousy record of treating the back.
Welcome to this episode of the RockFit Files. I'm Rocky Snyder, and we are well into season 4, where we are exploring all about anatomy and motion and the flow motion model developed and created by Gary Ward. And the flow motion model, if you're just jumping into the podcast, be sure to look at the previous ones for season 4 to get more information about what the flow motion model is. But in a nutshell, it is looking at what the human body does as it moves through space, primarily through the gait cycle. We have 206 bones, 360 joints, and well over 600 muscles that move through three-dimensional space at just the right moment, in just the right position, at just the right time. And provided you do it all in just the right way, you are an efficient mover. But nobody ever does that. There's always compensatory patterns and strategies that are developed. And you might go see let's see the next guest on the show. You might go see Dr. Emily Kiberd, who is in Midtown Manhattan. She is a chiropractor and also happens to be the podcast host of Muscle Medicine. So, Doc, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's so fun to sit and chat with you.
It's always fun to chat with you. Now, we first met in New York, and I want to say it was in June of 2014. You and I think we were both taking level 2 workshop or course of anatomy and motion. This is, of course, back when there were 4 levels of coursework before it turned into a 6-day immersion course. And then it evolved on beyond that too, more recently. But yeah, I think it was like in a dance or Pilates studio, wasn't it?
Yeah. And I feel very grateful to have taken the shorter version. I feel like my mind might have exploded because I know they were doing 6-day courses. I might have just collapsed and gone horizontal.
I agree. Honestly, the way in which we came into it, there was level 1. You learned a couple of the phases within the gait cycle. You tried to absorb as much as you could. We walked through it physically. We understood it from an intrinsic and extrinsic perspective as best we could. Brought it back to our work, tried to integrate it the best way we could. And then a couple months later, or a month or so later, level 2 would occur and so on. For me, I had to come to New York because when level 2 was occurring in California, I was actually on a surf trip in Baja, Mexico. And I don't regret that decision in any way because I got to go to New York and hang out with you. And that was really fun. So you've been a chiropractor how long now?
Since 2007.
2007, very nice. Palmer, where did you go to school?
I went to Western States Chiropractic, which is now University of Western States out in Portland, Oregon.
Nice.
Very much, if it was on the philosophical versus more medical spectrum, it's definitely more medical.
Wow, how interesting. You go from one anarchist city to another. It's like, are you an anarchist? First of all, let's just get that out of the way. No?
I just loved the energy of New York. And I think at my time in my life when I was in Portland, when I was around a lot of people who were settling down or had kids, or this was their second, third profession, I was single and in my late 20s. So
yes. So head to New York for all the right reasons. That's great.
Yeah.
And though you brought your practice with you, and so then that was 2007, 7 years later. How did you find out, first of all, how did you find out about Gary's work in anatomy and motion?
Yeah. So I found out about Gary. I think there was a moment when there were a lot of people who took neurokinetic therapy, David Weinstock's course, NKT, and they had gone through level 1, 2, 3, which is a muscle testing, looking for compensations course. And just a lot of the people, the NKTers, I think heard about Gary through David and kind of just a mass, met Gary and Chris and just dove deep into his flow motion model, which I don't think it was what it was called back then, but.
Yes. Yeah. So David went over to London and took a course from Gary. and they really connected. And then David said, well, why don't you come over and teach the course there? And as it happened, my timing was just perfect because that was the first one, Corte Madera, California, just north of Santa Cruz up by Marin. That was the first course there for level 1. And then they had connected with some people in New York, and there you have it. You were there too. So basically on the front step for North America, which is kind of nice. So when you got there, of course, you had NKT experience. And yeah, which interestingly enough, I think there might have been one other person in the course of 30 plus people that were not NKT practitioners. At least when I first took it, everyone was NKT. And I sincerely, I had never heard of NKT at that point. Of course, now I'm more familiar with it, but I felt like I was the black sheep in the herd of white sheep there. It was just the strangest thing. And then I go to New York and kind of the same thing happens, but you have more than the NKT, obviously the chiropractic practice. So what was it like, I guess, is what made you latch on to this and not just take it as another weekend course and put it off on the shelf and maybe take the certificate and put it in your filing cabinet or whatever? What was it that kind of bonded you to this?
Yeah, I think when my universe collided and met Gary Ward, the tools that I had under my belt were obviously a chiropractic degree, active release technique for 7 years, probably even longer than that because I had started it when I was in school, FMS, SFMA, functional movement systems from Gray Cook, and Graston. Like everything was kind of a passive modality, looking at movement, looking what is moving too much, what's not moving enough. I didn't feel like I had a really good toolbox for correctives. So I found, okay, what's moving too much? Okay, so what do I do with it? Do I just give it some concentric clamshells? I was dabbling in Strong First Kettlebell strength program, their training. And I think when my universe collided with Gary's, it just felt like no one else is talking about it like this. Like no one is looking at every single joint through the 3 planes of motion, through every single phase of gait. I had always been very interested in the feet, and yeah, it just blew my mind. And his principles were just like, no one was talking about this. And I was just fascinated, like, oh, here's this guy that was fitting ski boots and came up with this flow motion model. And I feel like there's not a lot of techniques that work from the ground up. It often feels like, okay, go lay on the table and then we'll work on you. Well, you know, how much of our day is horizontal? And then how much of our day is actively horizontal? Very little. And I just loved that it started from the feet up. And I loved that it looked at every single joint, even though at first it felt extremely overwhelming. And I loved being able to start to play and use it in cases where people weren't getting better. Like I've thrown everything at the person and it's still just like not, you know, they're maybe 80% better. What's going to knock out that last 20% of pain, discomfort, muscle tension, dysfunction?
Interesting. So I'm curious, with your practice typically, I know COVID has thrown everything sideways. So, you know, let's just talk pre-COVID because
Sure.
when the world was normal. And when you would see a client, the nice thing about the approach too is that it makes the client more self-reliant and self-disciplined and responsible for their own wellness and their own care. And we act as guides and not fixers, which is a fantastic burden to take off our shoulders because that's the last thing we need. We've got enough things in our life that we need to deal with. We don't need other people's burdens putting on us. So that was a beautiful thing. So when you have a patient coming in, will you combine your approaches, whether it's Graston technique, ART, manipulations, or anything of that nature, and then give them one or two things in regards to anatomy and motion, some type of movements to solidify, to reinforce? How does it work?
Yeah. So I think my kind of go-tos are first some sort of DNS, some dynamic neuromuscular stabilization, breath, joint centration, finding intra-abdominal pressure with some active release technique if it's needed. And I'll usually give them maybe 1 or 2 DNS moves. And if I have time in the first visit, I'll use anatomy in motion. So I tell people, I go, we're going to go from the core out, and then we're going to go from the feet up. So I love to do it. If it's, possible, I like to get it in the first session. Sometimes it can be overwhelming. Sometimes it can, you just see someone deer in the headlights, neurological overload. So I don't want to get them to that place. But if someone has that body awareness, I like to get to anatomy and motion in the first visit. It really depends. Like, I just saw this woman who was born in 1939, and she had done lots of kind of traditional physical therapy for sciatica, and it was down the left leg, and she just, her feet looked totally stiff and turned off, and she wasn't getting into right propulsion. And I was like, you know what? First visit, this lady's had all the kind of traditional physical therapy, doing dead bugs, bird dog. I was like, why don't we just work from the feet up? And so that's one case where it was in the first session, and we just got her into right propulsion. So, it really depends. I like to try and integrate it as quickly as possible, but I need to know that someone has some sort of body awareness, because otherwise, I feel like someone can go into kind of checked out really quick.
How do you determine body awareness? What is it that you,
That's
I mean, it's just a sense. I mean, I understand what you're saying. It's very important, but at the same time, this is all about building awareness too.
true. Yeah.
So,
So I think especially in New York, people come into the office in that really sympathetic state. And they kind of want to rush through their visit. So part of it's slowing them down. I think another aspect of body awareness is, if you say, feet together, bend forward, touch your toes, and they bend backwards or twist, it's kind of like, are we on the same page? And so, for example, for this woman, she just, like, her feet look so stiff, but she, I could tell her, go walk across the room a couple times. When I took her through a top tier SFMA screen, she could do everything I told her to do. So I was like, okay, let's start to kind of dabble in anatomy motion.
interesting. And so when you say, you mentioned something about you don't want to be overwhelming or overload them. So often is the case, and you also mentioned traditional physical therapy, and those two things I think go hand in hand like peanut butter and jelly, where they give you sheet after sheet of exercises with photos and instructions. They circle the ones on this side of the sheet and then that side of the sheet, and you walk out with this stapled booklet of 13 different items you're supposed to do for your plantar fasciitis. And it's just too much. So the compliance level is going to be just in the basement. Forget about it. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if they took it home, threw it on their desk, and then other piles of paper get loaded onto it. So what we usually do is, like, I want you to work on this one thing. Maybe I'm going to have you do a couple things and then come back and let's build upon that. And every time people just say, "Are just this?" I say, "Yes, just this. Let's fit this into your life. And if you're successful, I'm going to give you some more." And what we do, and I'm curious if you do the same thing, is we have them bring their phone with them so that we can videotape them doing the movement while I narrate kind of joint by joint what we might want to see. Just guidance, some kind of coaching cues as to what they may want to consider as they're doing this movement. And it's only like at the most 1.5 minute video that they can have on their phone, take anywhere they go. So there's very limited excuses for that. So curious, do you do the mimeograph? Do you do the video? I'm going to put you on the hot spot right now. What do you do?
Yeah. I believe in efficiency, especially in this day and age where our attention span is very short and where we don't have a lot of time, or maybe we choose not to make the time. So I think one of the beauties of anatomy and motion is, and this is one of the reasons why I really resonated with Chris and Gary, was it wasn't a course of like sit down and learn the material. It's like, okay, stand up and feel it in your body. So I like for what we give to be efficient. I actually, and this is like in terms of practice efficiency, I have every single exercise, including the anatomy and motion moves, just like recorded, me doing it. And so I just go, hey, go to our exercise library. You can check out right suspension. But then I also record it on their phone. Usually either I'll do the side that I want them to do, or I'll say, you know what, it's hard for you to feel into that side. Why don't you try the other side and then do the side that I want you to do? So we'll also record it. So I have it kind of in multiple ways. Like, here's our exercise library if you want to see me do it. Yes, it's going to be one move. We're going for efficiency. We want you to dose it through your day versus like go to the gym and do, you know, an hour of these exercises. And, you know, there's this concept in functional medicine called like the hormetic response, where if someone has multiple things going on, right? So they have gut dysbiosis, SIBO, a parasite. It's like, how can you give them one thing that might just clear up multiple things, right? So in terms of efficiency, you know, you could do, okay, do you do a right side plank to get, you know, your core activated on the right, or a right lateral flexion, and then you're going to do some clamshells, and then you're going to do some single-legged deadlifts, but you could just give them right suspension and kind of get something similar. So I like to think of, how can I give them the one thing? Sometimes it's like the linchpin, sometimes it's not, to get them feeling better.
That's great. I had never thought of videoing them with the opposite side, that they can really feel better or get into better. I'd never considered that. That's a great idea. And we have done a lot of filming also. So we got that YouTube channel, of course. This is where this is appearing, where we've got almost all of the phases and derivatives of that we can give them as links in an email later on. But primarily, just like you do, you know, one video, maybe two if they're really outgoing and they really want it. You just got to feel for one person and another. The more reluctant people, the ones that are just, they're busy, they're always on the run, they don't have time for this or that, and they can barely make it into this. I'm just going to give you one thing and go with that for now. And yeah, manageable doses. That's great. So how then, with this, obviously, as a part of your practice, it has changed in some way how you have your practice. Has it changed your philosophy in any way? I mean, we touched upon the fact that you were doing all these manual approaches and having people lay down, but nothing that was really active. But how have you since been doing this? Has it created this alteration, this change in you?
1000%. And I feel so grateful to have, you know, Chris talks about like, AIM is not another tool in the toolbox. It's the toolbox that everything else fits into, which I love. And not only from a philosophical change in my practice, but I had a office in Manhattan, and the hallway wasn't long enough to actually watch gait. So I went upstairs, I upgraded my office, made a bigger office, and the hallway literally goes from like one end to the other end of the office, because for the sole purpose that I wanted to watch gait and have people kind of get into their groove to really see an authentic gait. So from a physical stance, I literally made a really long hallway in a new office. That was back in 2015. And from a philosophical perspective, you know, even just the simple principles of joints act, muscles react, and how can something, you know, way back in the day, I would be pounding away at a trigger point in a gastroc. 20 minutes later, that trigger point's still there. The patient's like, yeah, it feels better, right? And I was like, yeah, I think so. How could I be more efficient and really more refined and finessed in how I approach that trigger point? So, you know, I was always thinking, okay, so what is working too much? What's not working enough? Why, like always asking that why, like, why is this here? Which I think, you know, when I watch Chris work, just mind blowing. He's like, you know, oh, this is an interesting observation that this plantar wart is on this foot, that, you know, the metatarsal head is dropping, and, you know, just like these really interesting observations that could be connections or they could not. And so I think the biggest change philosophically was to continue to peel the layers of the onion away and ask why. Why is something happening? Versus, I think as a practitioner, when we are burnt out, we can chalk it up to like, oh, it's just what someone's doing the rest of their day when they're not here, or they're not compliant to what we're giving them. Versus really asking yourself as a practitioner, like, how could I be of service? Like, am I missing something? Is there, asking more of yourself? And that's really what I had, all the doctors that I've worked with or have worked for me, trainer, massage therapist, was really trying to instill that philosophy of like, how could I do better, or 1% better every day? And I think just using the flow motion model to stay curious and to stay observant versus just chalking it up to like, oh, the person was sitting at their desk too many hours.
Yeah. These continual strategies that we can start to explore or just investigate, and some will have relevance and some that won't. But and I think for me, understanding that in itself was a huge moment, because leading up to that, I was thinking everything had relevance almost to the same degree. So this was related to that, but it's not always the case. So, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, I guess is what you'd say with that, right? Interesting. Very interesting. Do you have other people in your practice who have gone through the coursework? Just curious, or are you the only one?
I have 4 associates, a trainer, and a massage therapist that have gone through the course. And
Really?
I actually I brought Chris in to do kind of like an in-service for 3 days to just kind of tailor it. And we brought in patients that were kind of like the tricky patients of like, what are we missing? And had Chris work with them. And it was just like so amazing to see such a great mind. Like, what's his process? What are the questions he asks? Wow, he really dives deep into like old injuries. And some of these people we've been working for 7 years, and they tell Chris that they jumped off a dumpster when they were 14.
And they haven't told anybody that since. That was news to you.
Like, why didn't you tell me that 7 years ago? Your calcaneus is probably locked up.
It is something. Same thing happened. They were working with my daughter, and she said, well, yeah, I broke my toe. I'm like, what? Like, we live in the same house. What do you mean? You remember? I'm like, honestly, I don't remember. I had no idea. They start pulling on the toe a little bit, freeing it up. The next thing you know, her hip's feeling better, her neck's good, and all that. Going, oh my gosh. Yeah, it's amazing what we hear or what we ask, and what people are willing to tell us too at the same time. Wow. Yeah. So, okay, another time for a hotspot. There is this thing called the 100-day challenge, right? Where you have to fill out the flow motion chart for 100 days in a row. And I'm trying to find the people that have done this.
I have not done that. Okay. Oh my goodness. I didn't even hear of that challenge.
Oh, yes. Okay.
So Facebook group?
Yeah, maybe that's probably what it is. It started a little while back, probably about 4 years ago, I'd say. Laura Richards up in Northwest Territories up in Vancouver. I think she's up and around Vancouver. Well, she was the first one to complete it. So you fill out the flow motion chart, 400 plus joint mechanics across all the phases of gait, and you do that every day for 100 days. And so she broke the ice, and I thought, oh, okay, I got to do that. And honestly, it was a wonderful exercise, because after a while, you start to memorize, obviously, the phases, and you can just run down and you're just checking them off, almost like how short of a time frame could I get it. But then after a while, that kind of got old. You're like, okay, well, I don't know necessarily what the scapula are doing across the gait phase. And then you start to follow that and say, okay, if the scapula is doing that, let's pair that up with what the rib cage is doing. And then you start to explore the relationships between these two bony structures, and more gets revealed. And I guess this leads me to the question that as you started to explore the flow motion model and how joint relationships behave with one another in one way or another, because it's pretty much dual nature, and it's been doing this for tens of thousands, if not millions of years, and we are just exposed to this now. What were some of the epiphanies for you? What were some of those light bulb moments that you went, Oh my gosh, that is just awesome. I had no idea. Can you name a couple or one?
Yeah, I think, a common one is someone feels discomfort. Let's just say like discomfort in their left hip. And they're like, they're coming in for ART on the hip. And you watch them walk and they're actually probably shifting too much in a frontal plane into that hip and actually maybe trying to get them to shift into the right hip more to kind of help them give their brain a new experience of what center feels like and moving in and out of center. So people would come in and normally we would go to town and bang away on that hip with ART and, really changing to, okay, so maybe we get them to shift to the right and give their brain that new experience or free up what is limiting them from shifting into the right. So that's a really common one. And I think kind of a newer practitioner error of there's a spot of pain, so release it versus giving the body a new experience. Another one that comes to mind, for some reason, we've seen some baseball players with Tommy John surgeries, or even some men that have had a bicep rupture, and how that can limit supination and how that can limit the gait cycle after that surgery. So we would be doing scar tissue work, and the next time you would kind of check supination into that forearm, it would kind of go right back to where it was. And until you started to move through the gait cycle and start to connect arm, kind of arm spirals and work that kind of up and down the kinetic chain, did it start to not, the person was now starting to find some more freedom into that range. Yeah, those are like the two that come to mind.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty amazing when you start to understand the relationships between things and realizing no longer are we in the symptom-based approach of isolation or ultimate stability and stillness, but this integrative whole where the biotensegrity model, I guess, is when we start to affect one area, it draws us in that direction or pulls something else in another direction. You mentioned your entire team. You've had several people that have taken the course. So I'm curious also with the styles of assessments, because within our coursework, we have been taught the poor man's foot scan. We know how to use a force plate or understand force plate readings to some degree or other. For those with force plates, of course, probably a little bit more than those with not. But you got the poor man's foot scan. We've got the posture assessment, just static. And we also have a gait analysis, which we can videotape and freeze frame those moments in time within the gait cycle and compare one side to the other or what the body is doing in that moment in time and what's missing from it. And then we also have the dynamic check-in with what is the pelvis doing or what's the position of the knee or any kind of movements up and down the chain. So I'm curious to know if you use any of those on a regular basis for your own practice or with the time constraint that you typically have with insurance and so on, are you able to? And then with the training staff or the other staff members that have gone through the work, do they have assessment protocols of those selections that they use?
Yeah. So we have a force plate. We got the same one that Gary uses.
Cool.
It was interesting to see from a static position where people were placing their weight. You can also use it in a dynamic fashion where like people are walking up and down the hallway and that moment they step on the plate, it's a little more tricky and time consuming.
Yes, I found the same thing. So I don't do the dynamic force plate assessments, to be honest, just static. Give them something to look at so that they can have some connection. But go ahead and interrupt.
Yeah. And I think it's nice to do before and after.
Yeah.
So from a static, even just standing, feet under the hips before and after treatment. And, some of the things that we give often, which are so simple, are some sort of cog and We do a lot of big toe extension. I remember, I think in the first course, Gary mentioning that if you can't extend that big toe in propulsion, you're never going to get onto the other leg. And for some reason, that just really resonated with me, probably because I have a stuck toe on one side. And so using the wedges to get the toe to extend so that they can propel properly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, wedges. So you do a lot of wedge work?
Yes. And I know Gary has like denser wedges and they're smaller and more compact. I was actually making our own because we were giving them out so much. So I just took one of those blue yoga wedges and had my husband use a saw and cut them up.
Yeah, we
And
won't
I
tell
just
Gary. We'll leave that out. Gary, for listening right now, close earmuffs. Earmuffs. Okay, go ahead, Emily.
but it's not the density of Gary's, right? So
Right, it's not nearly as good.
Yes, like Gary's is probably a very superior product. But at the time, it was like, 30 patients a day giving out 2 wedges. It was a lot. So, yeah. And they're blue. They're not, the nice green and black colors. Yeah.
Yoga Direct or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's that. So, wedging. How do you explain? I love to hear how other people explain concepts and approaches and why you do this and why you do that, because it gives me more insight and helps me explain it better to the people that I'm trying to guide. So how do you explain the wedges and the use of them to the people that you're serving?
I talk about it kind of what Chris talks a lot about is like giving the body a new experience. So if your body hasn't felt your calcaneus or your heel bone in this way, inverted, everted. I usually don't use biomechanical language because it's sometimes feels overwhelming. But like if your heel hasn't felt this position or has felt this environment in a while, I'm going to use the wedge to give it a new experience. And it's going to be in a slow, controlled environment. It might be a bigger motion, right? So if we're taking a right suspension and taking someone through a right suspension and someone's like, well, I don't walk like this. And it's like, well, that's okay. You're just giving the brain new information to experience so that when you do walk and that, what is it, like 0.6 seconds that your foot's actually like striking the ground, it feels familiar. And so you won't default into whatever motion, whatever it's like, just dumping into that hip. So I try to explain it like how I've seen Chris explain it, of giving a new experience to the brain.
Got it. So being a chiropractor, there's other chiropractors that have gone through the coursework, as well as so many other professions, whether osteopathy, acupuncturists, manual and movement therapists, and even a few Western medical doctors, general med, have gone through the program. But for those that are also listening that are chiropractors, what kind of advice or insight can you provide for your colleagues in the chiropractic field in regards to anatomy and motion and integrating it into your practice? Or what, if there were peaks or pitfalls, can you give any kind of guidance or advice in that regard?
Yes. I think a really good chiropractor knows when not to adjust. And so I use adjusting when I think it's absolutely necessary. So if it's the breath, stabilization, anatomy and motion, so something is still locking down, then I'll go in and adjust. But having anatomy and motion is so much more empowering for the patient to give them something to do, to feel like they have a sense of control over their body versus relying on me. And I think early in my practice, I was going towards the idea of like, I'm going to fix you. And I found that the people that I enjoyed working with the most took what I did and ran with it, versus I literally had this guy lay on my table. He goes, "I lay, you fix." And I was like, oh my God. And this guy was going to get a hip replacement at like 46.
Well, there you go. That
And
solves the answer there too.
that moment, I was like, this is not how I want to practice. So, so there was a big shift. And I think, especially for chiropractors who are high volume, like they're seeing, I have a friend who sees 3 people every 15 minutes. Like you can't do the nuanced work that it takes to do anatomy and motion, and to have someone move and feel comfortable. And, the first time someone walks up and down a hallway, they're like super awkward because it feels weird to walk in front of someone else watching you. So I think for high volume practices, it is very tricky. I think even for practices where you're seeing one person every 15 minutes and it's more insurance based, it's still really tricky to work with someone in that capacity. And I have friends who've taken anatomy and motion and they're like, I really want to do it, but I would need the person to pay out of pocket for my time so that I could spend more time. And they're interested and they want to do it, but there's a financial constraint with how they designed their practice. So for me, I was willing to let go of the I lay, you fix and sacrifice that for the joy of working with people that I really enjoyed working with and I felt were flourishing and benefiting and getting better quicker. So yeah, I think knowing when not to adjust is like, chiropractors would be like, what? But I think it's such a gift. People still email and they're like, the things that you've taught me, I still use to this day. Like people I haven't seen in 10 years. And they're like, thank you so much. So that piece of empowerment is just, it's so powerful.
That is amazing, though. We get that from time to time where people go, you bump into them somewhere on the street or at a party or whatever, and they say, "Oh my gosh, those 2 things you showed, those 2 stretches." They'll usually say because everyone thinks it's a stretch, whatever. So those 2 stretches you showed me. I still do those every day. Oh my gosh, my knee pain hasn't. I feel great, and and you don't realize in the moment that you're giving somebody the tools for their life. It doesn't have that kind of gravitas for me when considering that until you realize, holy cow, that's something that these people were so affected. You had changed, or you guided them into a way that changed their life, their real world, their existence, to the point where they're still doing that. That's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. And like when you don't see people, come back into your office or the gym or the clinic, you're like, did I rub them the wrong way? Do they totally hate me? And then you run into them in the street and they're like, oh my God, you changed my life with that one move, that one stretch, which is the anatomy in motion, thing. And you're like, oh, okay. Like you always kind of wonder why people disappear.
Exactly.
Oh, it's for the good reason.
So many times. So what I like to do is we've got to bring us up to kind of like today. And because it wouldn't be fair not to talk in with the filter of anatomy and motion, and knowing that the body is always in a state of flux and we're continually creating subconscious strategies to get around issues or experiences in our life to the best way we can. We choose the next efficient means. So the world has changed in many ways, and we've had to create strategies these last 6 months or more. How has this, if we could apply it to, anatomy and motion, the philosophies and concepts, has that helped you in some way, or how has your world changed? How are you adapting new strategies, and how is that working?
From a physical experience or from
any
like a
way
practice?
You want to go, honestly, any way you want to go, from your own daily life with your family to your practice to just your whole outlook on the world itself?
Yeah. So I think in the last session when Chris came to Urban Wellness Clinic, it was literally the week before we closed. So we closed like March 16th. I think Friday was the 12th or something. And so he literally came, and it was like this high for all the practitioners, because it was kind of like the last piece. You know, I had sent them to DNS training, ART, FMS, SFMA, and Chris was like this kind of like, and there was such this high and buzz, and then we closed the clinic. And then months later, we closed the clinic, just because being in Midtown, just really, I just remember driving up 6th Avenue, and it was like there was no one on the street. Like it took me 15 minutes to drive to my clinic, which normally would take an hour. And so I think going back to this idea of giving the body a new experience, and how can you find center when you're, you know, pushed out of your center, right? Because I think especially as a business owner, as a Capricorn, I like structure, I like groundedness, I like consistency, and you know, this time is anything but. And I think, you know, especially from like example from doing telehealth. So I have someone on Friday up in Canada. They left New York and they're having knee pain. And so it's like, okay, what do you have with you? Do you have your wedges? And now here's an avenue to work together, to explore the body and feel something new and different, or to get them out of whatever is giving them the discomfort in their knees. So I think from a telehealth perspective, anatomy of motion is so powerful. I think moving in and out of center and finding your center is super powerful. I think all of us working from home, and I just remember Chris being like, none of us are really good at flexion. So like actually try and flex and, you know, have that anterior tilt of the rib cage and feel the flexion in the lower spine. Like all of us are just really not good at flexing, which you would think with all of us hunching, we'd be good at flexing in the lumbar spine, but we're actually not. So I think about that a lot, especially for all my people who tell me for the last 6 months, they've worked at a coffee table, from their couch onto a coffee table. And I think, you know, in March, there was this push to pivot, and it felt very, I mean, for me, it felt very masculine, especially being a mother of 2, almost kind of like this idea of like, I'm not doing enough, like I'm not pivoting enough to save the business. And I think going back to this idea of just moving in and out of center, and you said it really beautifully, of like our business breathes and it inhales and it exhales and it expands and it contracts, has really just shifted my mindset around what does it look like to be a business owner, a small business owner, to have employees, to, you know, I mean, both you and I have both had met multiple employees, and we've also been, you know, the solo heroes of our business. And so what does that look like internally, and what does it feel like, and what does it look like to speak about it externally? Because I think from an ego perspective, to be like, yeah, I have a clinic in Midtown Manhattan and I have a team of people that run the clinic, feeds the ego, but it doesn't necessarily feed the soul if it's not what I enjoy. So, and I think watching Chris work and peel away the layers of old injuries and also kind of emotional injuries has been interesting. And I feel like I'm kind of taking anatomy of motion and applying it to myself, maybe on a psychological level. So for example, like the day after I moved all of my stuff out of the clinic, I have woken up every single day with TMJ, and I have never had TMJ in the 39 years of my life.
Wow.
So, you know, of course I'm like, okay, so I'm going to ART it. I'm going to like do some DNS and some chin retraction and get stacked and get good intra-abdominal pressure. And then just kind of looking at it as like, what am I clenching and hanging on to that I'm not willing to let go? Like maybe I've been pushed so out of my center. What am I like death gripping to pull myself back to what is my known center or perceived center, versus what's a new experience I could give my body that would not make me death grip for life in my jaw every morning. So
Oh, very cool. That was a beautiful response. Exactly what I was hoping for too. Yeah, it transcends quite a few elements or areas of our life. It's not just looking at bones. It's more about looking at really life and how life is this cyclical kind of dual action. If we don't want one foot forward, we bring the other foot forward. And we're always going to be adapting and changing. And the moment we stop breathing, well, then we're going to adapt into something else. But in the time that we continually take the breath, well, that's an amazing journey. So Muscle Medicine is your podcast. Let's put a little plug in for that. What's the primary goal behind that podcast? What are the type of people that you have on the show, and how do people hear about it or hear it?
yeah, I think the main two guests that I bring on are people who know how to feed the muscle through nutrition or train the muscle. And I really look at the muscle as the organ of longevity. There's a lot of women with autoimmune conditions that listen in, just through my own journey of having Hashimoto's, and looking at Hashimoto's as how can you feed the muscle and train the muscle to help. For me, I've put my autoimmune condition in remission, and it was by looking at the body through kind of this muscle-centric medicine, which is one of my friends, Gabrielle Lyon, is what she practices, is muscle-centric medicine. So really looking at the body through the lens of the muscle. So that's a long answer to a question.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
And so Muscle Medicine podcast is, you can hear it on iTunes and Spotify and all the other platforms.
Yep.
And then Urban Wellness Clinic may be on a hiatus now, but it's going to appear in some form, I have a feeling, somewhere down the road. But right now, you just get to enjoy being a mom and experiencing what it's like for these magic moments, right? What a gift in many ways that COVID has bestowed upon you, is that you're not going to have on your tombstone, I wish I spent more time in the clinic and less time with the kids. So that's kind of nice.
Yeah. With my first, I went back to work after like 2 months, and my mother came to live with us to watch the kid. And I kind of missed out on that first year. So with number 2, there's no possibility of missing out on that, especially with the pandemic life. I also have a personal website, just my name, Dr. Emily Kiberd, and all of I have a program called Thyroid Strong, which is a 6-week strength training program for women with Hashimoto's to learn how to work out without burning out. And yeah, so I've tried to kind of move into serving my ladies all over the world versus the women just in New York City.
Oh, that's fantastic. So we'll make sure that we have all that contact information in the description of the podcast, as well as if you scroll down on the YouTube page, you'll find it just below, and just click on any of those links for Dr. Kiberd's work. And well, Doc, this has been a pleasure. I know we're kind of up against the clock, and this is where I just say thank you. And really, it's been a joy. And who would have thought, 6 years ago or whatever, that the life would unfold the way it was. But I do have to say this one thing in closing, is that when we got to do the foot manipulation or mobilization, and we are all in lines, chairs facing one another, I was hoping to get your feet. I never told you that, but I really did. Instead, they put me with Gigantor that had these enormous, like Bob Lanier size 23 feet. And I could barely hold him in my hand. I thought it was some cruel joke they were feeding me. Like, give the shortest guy the biggest guy and see how it goes. So
Who was it? Was it Eric Nelson?
It might have been. I don't know. You probably you look at his feet and you go, oh yeah, that must have been him. Wait, he spends his summertime somewhere in the Northwest Territories posing as Bigfoot. Whoever. I don't know, but it was enough. Actually, it was a gift in itself because I had no idea what to do with this big thing, that it propelled me into learning a lot more about foot mobilization. So had I gotten your feet, I don't know if it would have been the same, but it would have been a joyous experience in that moment itself. And who knows, maybe somewhere down the road, and if our paths cross again, I can get my hands on your feet. And that's not a hit. I'm just saying. Just professional.
I'm gonna share this one interesting thing. At a seminar out in the Hamptons with Chris and Gary, Chris was having really bad migraines, and he's like, please adjust my neck. And I adjusted his neck, and he went to sleep for 4 hours. And I was like, is everything okay? I've never, people talk about stroking patients out. I've never done that. I've always put them in lots of flexion to avoid that. And he woke up and he was like, he had like a different radiance about him. And he actually wrote I asked him to write about it, and he wrote about it, and I put it on my blog on Urban Wellness Clinic about his experience getting his neck adjusted by me. So anyway, I just thought I'd share that. I don't know, that was weird to share, but
oh, that's great. Okay, next time I chat with him, I'm going to ask him about that experience too. And I'll go to your blog and read it as well. So again, thank you so much. This has been great, and all the best in the 2021 and beyond.
Yeah.
If you'd like to find out more information about the Flow Motion Model, anatomy and motion courses, or Gary Ward himself, pick up a copy of his book, What the Foot, at findingcenter.co.uk. And while you're at it, pick up a copy of my book, Return to Center, where I take the Flow Motion Model and apply it to strength training and conditioning. You can get a copy of that at rockysnyder.com. Thanks for listening.